At the company banquet, my mom called me ungrateful in front of everyone. And then the CEO stood up and asked, "You do realize she owns the company?" I didn't say a word when she said it. Just sat there, smile frozen, heart sinking. Marlene, in her signature pearls and passive-aggressive tone, raised her glass to Grant and said, "At least one of my children appreciates where he comes from." Everyone laughed. I didn't. The banquet was meant to celebrate the anniversary of our family company, my father's legacy, the company he built from nothing. And yet, I sat at the far end of the table, barely acknowledged, like an afterthought. A guest in my own bloodline's empire. Grant was being celebrated, of course, my older brother, the so-called genius, the golden boy, the natural heir. No one in that room knew the truth, that without me, the business would have collapsed 5 years ago. That I owned 70% of it, quietly, legally, but I let them believe the story they loved so much. That Dad left everything to Grant, that I was just a bitter daughter with an attitude problem, the kind who never appreciated anything. That was the role they wrote for me, and I played it, until that night. I watched Grant give a speech filled with cliches and charm. I watched our mother beam like he invented the company himself. And then, in front of the board, the investors, and our family friends, she turned to me and said, "Maybe if you were more like your brother, we'd be proud of you too." I didn't flinch. I'd heard worse. I'd lived worse. But something in Mason's face shifted. The CEO who worked under me, who had kept my secret for years. He cleared his throat, set down his glass, and looked straight at Marlene. "With all due respect, ma'am, do you even know who signs your son's checks?" There was a pause. Sharp, uncomfortable. Mason stood slowly. "Liana is majority owner of this company. She has been for years. Grant reports to her. I report to her." Silence. Shock. You could hear forks drop. Marlene blinked. "That's not possible," she said quietly. Mason nodded toward me. "It's not only possible, it's reality." Every head in the room turned, and for the first time in my life, they were looking at me, not as the ungrateful daughter, but as the woman who built the empire they claimed as theirs, and I just sat there. Not angry, not smug, just seen. Growing up, my family didn't speak in love. They spoke in expectations. My father, Leonard, was all business, always on the phone, always at the office. He called it providing. My mother, Marlene, called it legacy. I just called it distance. Grant, on the other hand, was the golden investment. From the moment he could walk, Grant was groomed. "You're going to run the company someday," Dad would say, "just like your old man." At dinner, they talked stocks and, strategy. I cleared the plates. I asked once if I could come to the office with Dad. He said, "Maybe when you're older?" That maybe never came. I was the quiet one, the artist, the reader, the girl who won essay contests and read business books in secret. But none of that impressed them. "That's nice," Marlene would say, "but we're a numbers family." When Grant got a B+, he got a new watch. I got a lecture for getting too emotional in my essays. By high school, I stopped trying to impress them, but I never stopped learning. I interned at a startup during college, skipped parties to shadow mentors, and learned how actual leadership looked: calm, strategic, unseen. While Grant was failing his MBA, I was quietly building a network. Dad died suddenly my senior year. It was a heart attack, fast and final. At the funeral, everyone called Grant the future. But what they didn't know was that a year earlier, Dad had pulled me aside and said, "If something happens to me, talk to Arthur Klein. Don't let Grant ruin this." That conversation changed everything. Arthur was Dad's old partner, the quiet force behind the company's original structure. After the funeral, he handed me a sealed folder. Inside was a copy of the company's trust documents. My name, not Grant's, was listed as majority shareholder to be activated. On my 25th birthday, it was already in motion. Arthur looked me in the eye. "Your father saw how hard you worked. He just couldn't say it out loud in front of them. But he trusted you." I didn't cry. I just nodded. I wasn't used to being chosen. Even silently. Marlene and Grant assumed the company naturally belonged to them. I let them believe it, let Grant parade around with the title of strategic lead, while I, behind the scenes, made the calls. Mason, the CEO Dad had hired years ago, reported directly to me. He never questioned it. "You're the only one who acts like a leader," he once told me. Every time Grant made a bad deal, I was the one who cleaned it up. Every time Mom bragged about him at galas, I was the one writing the speeches. I didn't care about applause. I cared about keeping the company alive, because it was mine, because I earned it. But that night at the banquet, when she called me ungrateful in front of 100 people, I realized silence had protected them long enough. It was time to let the truth breathe. The signs were always there, not loud but steady, like background noise you eventually stop noticing. At Grant's high school graduation, my parents gifted him a Rolex. When I graduated 2 years later, I got a card and a strained smile. "You never ask for anything," Marlene said. "You're low maintenance." That's what I became to them. Low maintenance. Not because I was easy, but because I never complained. I stopped expecting birthday calls. I bought my own first car, paid my own tuition gap. And when I got my first job offer from a major firm, Mom didn't even ask what it was. But when Grant got hired as a junior consultant in Dad's company, a role created just for him, they threw a dinner party. Toasts, photos, a speech from Marlene about how he was born to lead. I served drinks and kept quiet. Even when I started consulting for real companies managing million-dollar campaigns before 25, Marlene called it cute. "She's finding herself," she told her friends. What she meant was, she's not doing what we told her to do. When Dad died and the company transitioned, Grant stepped into the spotlight with no real experience. I remember walking into a meeting he was leading, late, unprepared, sweating through his shirt. He was drowning. And I was the one sending notes under the table. I tried for a while to mentor him quietly, to suggest strategies, review his reports. But every time I corrected something, he'd roll his eyes. "I know what I'm doing, Liana." And Marlene would say, "Don't emasculate your brother. He's under pressure." The worst red flag wasn't even about business. It was personal. When I got promoted to head strategist at my other job before taking full control of our company, Marlene said, "You're not planning to act superior, are you? We all know Grant is the one with vision." I almost laughed, but I didn't. What they really wanted was my silence, my usefulness without acknowledgement. As long as I didn't take credit, they could keep pretending Grant was the architect. And I let them. Until that night. Because that night, Marlene crossed the final line. She insulted me in public, on my payroll, in front of my employees. And that's when I knew. The time for quiet loyalty was over. I wasn't going to humiliate them. I didn't need to. The truth would do that all by itself. The night of the banquet, I wore black. Not as a statement, but as armor. I knew what I was walking into. A room full of people who didn't know who I really was, led by a family that had made a career out of pretending I was a footnote. Marlene started early. Compliments for Grant's incredible leadership. Jokes about how I must be too busy journaling to show up to real board meetings. The crowd laughed. I smiled through it. I always had. But Mason caught my eye from across the room, and I knew he was done watching too. Grant stood at the podium, half reading a speech he didn't write, slurring through statistics he barely understood. People clapped out of politeness. Marlene looked at him like he was royalty, and then she did it, turned to me and said, "You know, if Liana had half his drive, we'd be twice as successful." The room shifted. Some people laughed. Others glanced away, uncomfortable. I said nothing, but my heart was pounding. Not with shame, with clarity. That comment wasn't a joke. It was the story they'd always told, that I was lesser, unseen, ungrateful. And then Mason stood, calmly. No theatrics, just truth. "I think everyone here deserves to know something," he said. "Liana isn't just involved in the company. She owns the majority. She's been running it for years while Grant's been taking credit." Marlene's face went tail. Grant laughed nervously. That's ridiculous. Mason didn't blink. She signs your checks. Ask Arthur Klein, or better yet, check the trust. It's public record now. Silence spread like a slow wave across the room. The investors turned. The board members looked stunned. Someone whispered, "Wait, she's the owner?" Marlene looked at me like I had betrayed her. But I hadn't. I had just stopped protecting the lie. You've been humiliating your own boss all night, Mason added. I'd suggest a little gratitude. And then he sat down. Calm. Clean. Lethal. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother speechless. I saw my brother stunned. And I saw myself. Not as their daughter, but as the woman they underestimated. And I didn't need to raise my voice. The truth had done the shouting for me. After the banquet, I didn't go home. I drove aimlessly for hours, passing familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign. I wasn't crying, I wasn't angry, I was hollow, like the silence after a scream. The truth was out, and somehow that made everything heavier, not lighter. My phone buzzed nonstop. Buzzed. Missed calls from Marlene. A string of messages from Grant, mostly angry, some pathetic. How could you do this to me? You humiliated mom. This is why no one likes you. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have words, but because nothing I said would matter. Mason sent a single message. You did the right thing. And maybe I did. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a funeral for the last illusion I'd held on to. That maybe someday they'd see me, that if I stayed loyal long enough, I'd be enough. The next morning, I got a voicemail from Marlene. Her voice was calm. Too calm. I hope you're happy, she said. You've burned this family to the ground for your ego. Don't come back. I listened twice, not because I was surprised, but because even in rejection, she made it sound like I owed her something. I stayed in bed that entire day, canceled meetings, ignored emails, let the world spin without me. For so long, I had moved in silence, built in shadows, and now that the spotlight was finally on me, I wanted to disappear. Not because I was ashamed, but because I was exhausted. Jacob, my closest friend from grad school, came by that night. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't ask what happened. He just brought takeout and sat with me in the quiet. Sometimes healing doesn't need conversation. It just needs someone to hold space. I finally said it out loud. I didn't want to hurt them. I just didn't want to keep hiding. Jacob nodded. You gave them every chance to respect you. They chose not to. That's on them. I didn't reply. But I held on to those words like a lifeline. For the first time in my adult life, I realized I had no family left. At least not the kind you're born into. And strangely, that felt like freedom. There was no more pretending, no more shrinking, no more waiting to be chosen. But I also knew this wasn't the end. Marlene wasn't the type to walk away quietly, and neither was Grant. If anything, this was just the beginning. Of the fallout, of the resentment, of the war they thought. I hadn't started a war, I'd just stopped losing one. 2 days after the banquet, Arthur Klein called me. His voice was calm, but there was a weight to it. You need to come by the office, he said. There are things you should see. I didn't ask questions. I just drove. Something in his tone told me this wasn't just about paperwork. He handed me a folder, thick, neatly organized, labeled with dates and internal memos. Grant's name was on almost every page. Unauthorized bonuses, lavish spending, private travel billed to the company. I wasn't surprised, but I was tired of pretending it was harmless. Your father anticipated this, Arthur said. That's why he structured the trust the way he did. He knew Grant wasn't ready, but he hoped, with you guiding quietly, things would stay balanced. Clearly, that didn't happen. I nodded slowly. It was one thing to be invisible. It was another to be used. There were also letters. Notes. Dad had written but never sent. one to me, never mailed. He wrote, "I know your mother doesn't see you. I regret not defending you louder, but I built the foundation. You'll finish the house. I trust you." My hands trembled holding that page. I hadn't cried in years. I did then. Marlene, meanwhile, had started damage control. She emailed the board blaming Mason for miscommunication, insisting that Grant was still the intended heir. A few members forwarded it to me, confused. "Is this true?" one asked. I responded with 2 documents, the trust and the ownership transfer. Mason held a private call with the executive team. "Let's be clear," he said. "Liana has always been the one making the hard calls. Grant may have smiled for the press, but we all know who kept this company afloat. This isn't new. It's just finally visible." Then came the audit. At my request, I wanted every corner checked, every expense verified. Not to punish, to cleanse, to protect the thing I had poured my life into from turning into another, monument to ego and entitlement. The results were worse than I feared. Grant hadn't just misused funds, he had signed off on risky contracts that put the company's reputation on the line. I realized then that silence had allowed rot to spread. My quiet loyalty had fed their illusion of control. Arthur looked at me across his desk. "You have a choice now," he said. "You can cover this up, preserve the family name, or you can clean house and start over." My throat tightened. Because deep down, I already knew. I wasn't going to protect the family that never protected me. I was going to protect the company, my company, from them. I didn't fire Grant immediately. I called a board meeting instead, in person. No assistants, no distractions, just the decision makers and the truth. I presented the audit, line by line, every unauthorized charge, every risk taken without approval. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't need to. Grant showed up late, smug, probably thinking this was damage control. He didn't bring notes, just his ego. When I finished, I turned to him and asked, "Do you want to explain?" He opened his mouth, laughed nervously, then looked around the room for backup. There was none. Mason didn't flinch. Arthur folded his hands. The CFO shook his head. Grant tried to blame a junior manager. I interrupted. "You signed the contracts. You authorized the transfers. The company's not your playground, Grant." That's when he realized I wasn't bluffing. The vote was unanimous. Effective immediately, Grant was removed from all company operations. No press release, no ceremony, just a quiet, clinical exit. I walked him to the elevator myself. He wouldn't look at me. "You think this makes you better?" He muttered. "No," I replied. "It just makes me responsible." Then came Marlene, furious. She called me at 1 a.m., voice trembling with rage. "How dare you embarrass your brother like this? This family has been through enough." I said, "Nothing at first. Then, you're right. This family has been through enough. And now I'm ending it." She tried to threaten me. "Your father would be ashamed." I almost laughed. "He's the one who gave me this company. You just never noticed." I hung up, blocked her, and for the first time, her silence was a gift. The next week, I held a press conference. Nothing flashy, just honest. I clarified ownership, apologized to partners for past missteps, announced a restructuring plan. I didn't mention names. I didn't need to. The board backed me fully. Investors responded with renewed trust, and something shifted. Employees began stopping me in the hallway, not just with updates, but with respect. "Thank you for taking charge," one said. Another whispered, "We always knew it was you." Their words landed softly, but they hit deep. Justice didn't look like revenge. It looked like clarity, like no longer having to pretend, like walking into the building your father built, and finally feeling like you belonged in every room. I didn't destroy my family. I just stopped lying for them. And in that silence, I found power. The building felt different now. Not bigger, not louder, just clearer. Every step I took down the hallways echoed differently, not because anything had changed structurally, but because for the first time I wasn't walking in my father's shadow or my brother's lies. I was walking in my name, People stopped calling me Leonard's daughter or Grant's sister. They started saying Ms. Hart or just Liana. And that shift, from attachment to acknowledgement, was quiet, but it stitched something back together inside me I didn't know was still torn. I moved into my father's old office, not to claim a throne, but to clean the dust off a legacy that had been misused. I left the chair facing the window, just like he had it. But on the desk, I placed only one thing: the letter he never sent me. I didn't reach out to Marlene again. I didn't need her apology. I didn't want it. I accepted that she loved an idea of me that never existed, and rejected the version that did. And I wasn't going to waste another breath trying to make myself smaller for her comfort. As for Grant, I heard he started consulting. Smaller projects, less visible. He stopped calling. I never blocked him. I didn't have to. Sometimes the absence of war is peace enough. He'd gotten what he wanted for so long, the spotlight, until it burned him. I started something new, a mentorship fund for young women in business. I called it the second seat, because that's what I sat in for so long, the seat next to power, behind greatness, beneath notice. Now I was building more seats for women who'd been told to stay quiet. One morning, an intern knocked on my door. "I heard what you did," she said. "It gave me hope." I smiled gently and said, "Then it was worth it." That was the real inheritance, not the company, not the shares, but the freedom to be exactly who I am. There are still moments when I hear Marlene's voice in my head, sharp, disapproving, calling me ungrateful. But then I remember, gratitude doesn't mean silence. It doesn't mean staying small. It means honoring what you build, even when others tried to erase you from it. I was never the problem. I was the solution they didn't want to admit existed. And now I no longer ask to be seen. I walk in, and the room sees me, because when Mason said, "She owns the company," he didn't just mean the shares. He meant, she finally owns her story.